Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Astrid Tumines, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Executive Education and Director of Research at the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It is with great pleasure that I welcome our guest today, Dr. Sergey Karaganov. And let me just say a few words about him. Really quickly, we just met a few minutes ago, but I joke that I used to meet with Dr. Karaganov back in my youth when I lived in Moscow in 1990 to 1992. And I thought for a while that I wouldn't encounter things Russian anymore, but since Singapore is a little magnet that attracts many things, I think it's with great pleasure that welcome Dr. Karaganov here today. You have read Dr. Karaganov's bio, and I think today he is Dean of the School of International Economics and Foreign Affairs of the State University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And I just learned today that this is one of the most popular schools now in Russia, with over 1,000 students and a very rigorous academic program. I would also like to say that Dr. Karaganov is what I would call royalty when it comes to the think tank crowd, the political analysts, political scientists, and one of the very best, I would say, because I have followed his work for many, many years. I want to mention a few things about his international citizenship. He has been a member of the Trilateral Commission since 1998 and was on the International Advisory Board of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, which is, of course, arguably the most elite think tank in the United States. Formerly, he was also Deputy Director of the Institute of Europe at the former Soviet Academy and then Russian Academy of Sciences. And he was an advisor to both Presidents Yeltsin and Putin. So without further ado, I would like to give the microphone now to Dr. Karaganov. He will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a discussion with you. Thank you. Sergey.
Thank you very much, Astrid. It's a great pleasure to be here. After all, at a school which is named after the greatest practitioner of development policy in the world, but also one of the greatest thinkers, who has been in Russia several times already, Dr. Kuan Yew, and of course, I mean, he impressed us tremendously, and now, I mean, whenever Dr. Kuan Yew comes, I mean, he attracts small crowds, I mean, because big crowds are not allowed. No, but the prayer, I mean, but people feel themselves extremely privileged to talk to him, to listen to him, and you are privileged, of course, to study in a school which he founded, and I think, as I understand, still supports. So my lecture here, and I actually, when I was preparing for this lecture, I decided just to dictate it first in English. And then, so I have a text, and later I will send you the revised version of this article, of this text in English, so you'll be able to distribute it. And I will place it on my website or publish elsewhere. It is called, I mean, at first I thought it should be Geoeconomic and Geopolitical Revolution. But then I understood that, I mean, that over the years I have been talking too much about revolutions, technological, political, economic, etc., etc. And all of a sudden I understand that we are living in a state of permanent revolution. Let me remind you that the term permanent revolution was created by one of the greatest thinkers of the early 20th century, and one of the most brilliant thinkers, Leon Trotsky, who was one of the worst persons my country ever produced, though. But we are thanks God, his theory of permanent communist revolution failed, as we know now for sure. But what we are experiencing now is a concurrent and accelerating pace of change, which actually means that we are living in a permanent revolution of a different kind. So my talk will be divided into three parts. Why? Then what are the main features, and where is the place of Russia in that? Because I'm a Russian, and you expect me to speak a little bit at least about Russia. So why? Well, first of all, the political revolution which occurred at the beginning of the 90s or end of the 80s, we are celebrating now the 20th anniversary of it, brought an unforeseen consequence. People were celebrating the end of communism, the victory of liberal democracy. What has happened actually was people did not foresee, and that is tremendous expansion of the world market. 2.5 billion people, or 2 billion at first, now almost 1.5 billion, were added. Both workers and consumers were added to what used to be the world capitalist market. The other billion was just locked from it, sitting in the communist camp. And this expansion of workers and consumers brought huge, extensive, I would say, enlargement of the world market. It was coupled, of course, with the new wave of science and technological revolution. This time it was informational revolution, which brought about unheard of speed of transaction of finance and knowledge. Two things married in one decade brought about a tremendous growth of wealth in the world. Of course, Singapore is the prime example, but not only. So these two revolutions, and actually we are living through the continuation of this process, though, probably that wave of science and technological revolution has not ended. It has exhausted, but we are waiting, for new waves. But third, and that is less discussed, third feature, which I would like, and that is a military political revolution of the new kind, which is happening now. That military political revolution started, of course, earlier than 20 years ago, when the Soviet Union and then Russia and the United States and other countries blocked each other military nuclear might by weapons. 10 years after the revolution, after after the failure of the Soviet state, it looked like military power became, at a lower level, became usable again. And we all remembered that, there was this superpower, United States, which allegedly spent, 600 billion more than everybody else produced. We've heard all these figures. But that superiority has also proved so far to be passing and futile. That if the United States wouldn't have committed two grave mistakes, one was called Iraq, another Afghanistan, and while one day trying to use its superiority and failing, we would have lived probably in the old world still. But what has happened is that even now the conventional superiority or conventional force at a larger level is becoming unusable, or at least visibly so. And that means that you could not threaten military force, directly or even indirectly, like in many times, to get your political points or to get your political aims. A very rough but clear example. China would have resurrected, many times over the last centuries, if not for a direct use of force against China. Many wars, during the 19th century prevented, and the early 20th century, prevented China. But now it happened that China is developing peacefully because nobody could stop it. I mean, Russia was stopped several times. Britain was stopped several times from growing by military might, by wars, or by military pressure. Nobody could do that anymore with the big countries. And that produced, this growth of world GNP and the decreasing possibility of using, military might and some other factors, produced, of course, or helped the great shift in the world economy. It's not only that the GNP has been growing at an unheard of pace, 5%. The fastest ever growth in the history of humanity. The world GNP started to shift to the new countries. New countries were able to benefit from globalization. And during the first wave of globalization, of course, it was the old world which benefited from it. But because of this concurrence of factors, since mid-90s, the other worlds started to benefit, and that's where the growth of the Asian economy and then the now so famous shift of the world wealth to China and to Asia as a whole has been happening. Then, of course, the new industrial revolution started. That industrial revolution, we are experiencing that. We don't call that industrial revolution, but that is very much like the industrial revolution we had in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Tremendous growth of the production of basic products, mostly in Asia. Of course, so far, and somewhat in Latin America, starting from cement to refrigerators and cars. That industrial revolution brought another hidden but change in the world economy, world political economy, which is not yet comprehended. And that is another feature of this revolution. And that is that basic commodities again started to be important. 20 years ago, or even 30 years ago, be that communist or Marxist economists or liberal economists, everybody agreed that their share of commodities in the world GNP would decrease endlessly. Nobody knew where would they reach the zero, but nevertheless, that was, the general feeling. Second, it was believed that territory was losing its economic and political value. Not anymore, at least for the time being. Because of this growth for a growing need for basic commodities, energy, resources, and food. And of course, food, this shortage of food which we have experienced 2 or 3 years ago is a long-term process, because what we're having is a change because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the growth of Asia. We're experiencing a change in their diet of 2 billion or 3 to 3 billion people. They are starting to eat, you here, living in the richest country, one of the richest countries in the world, and clearly the richest country in Europe, know that you are having a normal diet. But Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia has been a vegetarian civilization. Now they starting to eat normally, that is consuming protein. Normally or abnormally. Of course, Americans, we all know that, believe that, that eating protein some Europeans is abnormal, as well as some Americans. Yes, we could foresee a continuous trend towards the growth of demand for food, thus increasing demand for water, and increasing demand for arable land. And that's where, I mean, it has not yet been debated or properly understood, but people are feeling something is happening. And of course, I mean, you know about Chinese buying 100,000 hectares of land in Latin America and Africa. The Arabs do the same. My country, Russia, have been unfortunately renting already, I mean, thousands and thousands of kilometers of land to the Chinese and of wood, etc., because we couldn't develop them ourselves. So land with resources and arable land is is growing in political and economic value. Just an anecdotal evidence about that. Again, it is not yet comprehended. But many of you who study international relations have heard about the growing military political competition for resources of the Arctic. I mean, just to remind you, there is Russians in a great PR gesture had put a platinum banner on the North Pole. I mean, using its a deep water bathyscaphe. We laughed at first, saying, I mean, that is a great PR for Russia, of course, but nobody thought that would be, what would that open up? And that opened up an open military political, so far, of course, rhetorical competition for these resources. And let me remind you that, I mean, NATO is taking Arctic dimension. NATO is taking. Russians are preparing for warfare in the Arctic. Though, as far as I know, we are preparing something like a platoon or a company, not more than that. But the competition. Yes, the competition goes, and listen attentively, for 25% of undiscovered world resources of energy. Undiscovered. That's for 25% of a zero. And probably they will never be discovered, or if they are discovered, it will be too expensive to get them out, to recuperate them. But that shows, I mean, how political economy is changing and the philosophy. People are competing for territory again in a very new sense, and that should be, of course, taken into consideration when we assess, I mean, the world of the future. And of course, all that is accompanied by the diffusion of technological knowledge. Now, because the Cold War is over, and because the old world could not dominate the intellectual market, I mean, the universities spread, knowledge spreads, internet helps, and if a country has a proper educational system, it could become a technological leader in a matter of years. That is the prime example of Singapore. And the second prime example is China, of course. I mean, nobody thought ever, and still very few people understand outside of maybe of the region, how fast the technological advancement of China goes. I mean, we have to just show you your example, I mean, and bang into the heads of our European, American, and Russian friends, because people still believe that China and Asia are copying, and they are still, I mean, depending, of course, largely depending on technological innovation coming only from the old world. That is not becoming not true. That's still largely true, of course. But it is becoming less and less true, because in 5-10 years we will see new technological leaders of the world. Most of them will be in your area, and that is again unforeseen consequences of the end of the Cold War, because during the Cold War there were strict and very harsh limitations on diffusion of technology. Now they are gone, and plus knowledge is spreading. Universities like yours are spreading all over the world, and people could adapt to the new technological revolution much faster. And of course, another feature of this revolution is the fact that the old world has lost its moral leadership, for the time being at least. It seemed that only 10 years ago that there was an end of history. Now, I mean, there is a growing fight among the liberal democratic and authoritarian models of development. Of course, that is artificial. We all know that eventually, I mean, with development, people want more democracy. And among the ranks of the most developed countries, only two could not qualify as Western democracies. One is the unique Singapore, and another is Qatar. But Qatar is not a case. Because Qatar is simply, I mean, is a place where people just using foreign labor, just pumping oil, and that's it. But other 13 are relatively liberal democracies. So so down up the ladder, I mean, people develop democracies. But the problem is that the old world is even understanding that eventually the world will become more democratic and more liberal, that it is losing now. And that's why we have a new ideological struggle, a new ideological battle, which is coming, which is fighting. We are fighting, and that is the battle between so-called liberal capitalism and authoritarian capitalism. It is artificial, but it is influencing the world, and it influences the debate. All the more that the competition between the models is not the struggle between ideologies. It is the issue also of redistribution of resources. The winners have resources flowing to them, mostly human. I mean, previously, all people went to liberal, democratic, wealthy countries. Now, I mean, more and more people are going to countries like Singapore, China, to work. Because intellectuals are going there, professors are going there, because they see that there are big businessmen are going there because they see the opportunities. In the 90s, there was a huge, and in the 80s, huge outflow of human resources from the former communist party countries, including myself. You remember that, of course. And now, I mean, part of these people are coming back, or else coming, I mean, to the more faster developing nations. So, also, I mean, the situation is exacerbated that we are living is in the intellectual vacuum. People do not understand what is happening. I mean, and very few people like myself are arrogant enough to pretend that we do not understand. I mean, people pretend that they understand, but the things are moving too fast. I mean, just remember the crisis which we have been living through recently and are still living. I mean, nobody actually predicted, or almost nobody predicted. Nobody knows for sure what has been happening. What has been, it was cured by old way, just throwing resources on it, and using old Keynesian, more or less, old Keynesian models. And it is clear that we will have, because we do not understand what has happened, and probably, that crisis which we have been experiencing is the result of many, not of Americans, overspending, etc., but of all these many changes. But very few people, if any, could explain what and why. The same is happening with even in the field which I know the best, the military political. So all in all, and that is coupled with a very well-known feature, which in the School of Government, of course, study more than anything else, and that is the weakening of the institution of international governance. I mean, starting from UN, which has been going down and down for at least 2 or 3 decades. Then we got the G8. Russia, for reasons of prestige, has been fighting to get into G8. We got at last. And when we got at last, we understood. That was a great club of people talking, for a while with each other. Pretending that they're doing anything, and then signing absolutely senseless, huge communiques, which were never, never implemented. There is an organization in Canada which actually watches the implementation of this of the G8. The figures are fantastic. Sometimes 70, 80, 90% of the decisions are not implemented, and the 10, 20, 30% which are implemented are not implemented because they're common decisions, but because they're made by national governments. And that's simple, concurrence of events. It's nothing to it. Then, after having G8 more or less failed, we have created first G12, G14 in 3 years. That has been happening during the last 2 years. 2 years. G12, G13, 14, and then G20. Now we have G20, and allegedly G20 is doing something. But G20 is, again, the same machine, which helps because it creates the aura of governability. But it does not provide for any kind of decision or of decision-making mechanism or for mechanism for implementing the decisions. It's a nation states are back in a very strange way. That is also a relatively new feature. But we all know that if we see that the nation state is back, when there is a competition for territory, when things are unclear, it is a dangerous. We are getting into a dangerous turf. And of course, we have now that the undisputable leader of the world has lost most of its power, still being their leader, intellectual, economical, political. The United States, Europe, and I could dwell on that. I know that all too well is running over the hill from international arena. Lisbon has shown that Europe is actually withdrawing and not playing any world role. China is still hesitant. India is still hesitant. Russia flexes its muscles more than its muscles are, but we couldn't feel the vacuum. Of governability. We pretend that we are stronger. I think that is positive. By the way, even if somebody pretends that it steers events in the world where we are experiencing a vacuum, a multiplying vacuum of governance, and in some cases, like in the larger Middle East, it's a deepening vacuum of security. If somebody pretends, it's good. The fact that the United States has withdrawn or was thrown away is pleasant to many people who didn't like the omnipotence of the United States, but is very dangerous to the world because instead of the United States we have nothing for the time being. We haven't created, and there is no process for creation of new institutions. And Europe wouldn't be filling that gap, not only because of several mistakes which has been done during the last several years, but also because of the historic fatigue which has come to the fore. It's not only the mistake of the Maastricht when they decided to opt for common foreign policy, which was unattainable. and which led to a common foreign policy by a lowest common denominator. It's not only too rapid an extension because Europe lost its strategic aim, but also, and largely, I think, because of the historic fatigue which came to the surface due to these two circumstances. So it will be unable to develop fast. The corruption is not only is not a result only of national character or of history, but of the very simple fact that when Putin came to power, the country was functionally a failed state, and Putin and the group of people who were with him understood that they knew that they had a failed state. So to restore it, I mean, they didn't have resources, so they actually bought the bureaucracy. They allowed the bureaucracy to steal as much as possible. I mean, they restored the state, but the price is steep. So for the next 5 years, I would see stagnation. After that, I mean, very possible with the change, 5-7 years with the change of generations, we will start a new wave of modernization. For the time being, we will be muddling through, hoping to not to alienate ourselves from Europe, because that is dangerous for our national integrity. As to the force, as to the use of force, Astrid, unfortunately, these two operations were highly successful. I mean, I hate to say that. Of course, we won a battle in Chechnya, not a war, but we have been waging that war for 200 years. I mean, so yes, and the challenge there was that we would lose a part of our territory, and we would start to disintegrate. Then the disintegration was stopped. I mean, with very brutal force. As with Georgia, again, I mean, people were alienated, but unfortunately, again, and that's very unfortunate about the moral state of the world, the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany talked about expansion of NATO as an inevitability and as a foreseeable future in July 2008, not any time after Russia used its armor. That is the unfortunate fact of the world. I mean, I would have hated to say that, but that happened. So these are victories. I mean, of course, I mean, partly they're Pyrrhic victories. You know that you couldn't eventually become a modern power by winning wars. That's true, but as a Russian scholar and a Russian citizen, I had a choice. Having a relatively backward country not modernizing fast enough, we're losing wars or winning wars. I would prefer a country which is winning wars. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will now open the floor for questions from all of you. Kindly raise your hand and introduce yourself quickly before asking your question, and please make your questions direct and brief. Yes, please.
My name is Larry Lam, chairman of PortTech from the private sector. Dr. Karaganov, Russia is known to play a key role in the nuclear issue of Iran. How do you see the situation will play out? And how much do you think the outcome of this nuclear issue will depend on the power struggles within the Iranian domestic politics? And second question is that you mentioned that nuclear weapons has been a pacifier, but I think that is probably only true during the Cold War, when there are a few nations who has those nuclear weapons and there's a common code of conduct. But now with the proliferation of nuclear weapons, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, Libya all try to have it, and Israel, of course, and they're mad enough to use the nuclear weapons, some of these countries. How could that be a pacifier anymore?
Thank you, Mr. Lam. The Iranian question. The Iranian elite wants nuclear weapons, and it will get nuclear weapons. We have lost the opportunity to stop them a few years ago because we negotiated, we pretended to negotiate, and then we lost our opportunity to use force. Unless the only way by which I think Iran could stop its nuclearization is an internal revolution, which will destabilize the country. But even if the Iran turns more liberal or more Western, quote unquote, it will go towards nuclear weapons faster. The Iranians want nuclear weapons. They fear their neighbors. They have tremendous tremendous distrust of everybody. That's not only the United States or other nations, but everybody, because they have had a very unfortunate history, and we must all remember what has happened during the Iran-Iraq war, when not only China, when not only United States and Soviet Union supported Iraq in order to put down, but we actually closed eyes. I mean, we all closed eyes to the fact that Iraqis used chemical weapons en masse against Iranians, and nobody in the world talked about that. And it was the first time in history since the First World War so they want nuclear weapons for security. They want that for prestige. And now I think we have lost the possibility. So the question is now looks like that. Whether they will develop nuclear capability and then stop and become de facto nuclear, because they will get then prestige and security, or whether they will deploy the bomb. That's the only choice I think we have. That's a very unfortunate conclusion. First, so I mean, of course, we should all pressure, and Russia should join, and nobody is happy about that. First, but that will happen. And we have to think in different terms now. We have to think about multiple deterrents. We have to think about provision of security guarantees to all countries of the Middle East. I mean, and I am happy that I've been calling for that in Russia, that we should consider that possibility together with Americans, and at least. And I'm happy to hear that at one point, State Secretary Clinton mentioned that. She was immediately attacked, but she mentioned the possibility of providing nuclear guarantees for others, for the countries of the Middle East, including Israel. Of course, that could possibly postpone or stop their chain reaction. As to the role of nuclear weapons, now, well, first of all, I mean, there is a philosophical question. I mean, after a few years, I mean, countries which acquire nuclear weapons become much more realistic about that. But of course, you have to live through these few years. At first, in 1940s, 1950s, earlier than the 50s, Russia and the United States were playing games or thinking about using nuclear weapons. Then they stopped somewhere in the mid-50s, much earlier than the Cuban Missile Crisis. I could document it. Henry Kissinger, by the way, about 10 years ago, wrote an article saying that the more nuclear powers are there, the more situation is there, the stable situation is there. The question is almost a religious one. I believe that in the world which is losing faith in God, and which is not fearful of hell anymore. It's better to have an artificial hell hanging over them. All the more that it helped for a while. And I think that it helps now, for sure, because it ties the hands of big powers. It ties the hands of Russians, it ties the hands of the Americans, and it prevents at least them from playing hardball, which we would have played in this very, very rapidly changing world. That's saying that I'm not for proliferation, first. And second, there is a legend that if big countries cut nuclear weapons, this legend is put into the text of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, then other countries will lose incentive or decrease the incentive to get nuclear weapons. That's a legend, a myth. When Russia and Soviet Union and United States were cutting very fast their nuclear weapons, 1990s, 3 nations became nuclear: Israel, Pakistan, and India. So I mean, it's simple, because nations want nuclear weapons for 2 main reasons. One is security, second is prestige. And not because, I mean, America and Russia are cutting their arms or not cutting their arms. And the third hard, cold-blooded analysis. If we and the United States cut deep enough, small nuclear countries, I mean, not big, but big countries, but small nuclear countries, will have an incentive to increase their nuclear potentials and become, I mean, nuclear superpowers in several years. And we don't want to create these incentives for anybody. That's why I believe that we shouldn't go lower than the ceilings which are now being negotiated at all. But again, that is the result of my analysis of the minds of the documents which I have uncovered in the secret archives of the United States. I read, I mean, all the documents of the 50s there. I mean, I'm the only one who was able to waste that time. I mean, and the only Russians, and they didn't even think that a Russian could come. But I was reading the minutes of the Security Councils, and then I talked to many of our marshals and generals. I mean, of course, we didn't have this kind of archives, and I saw what kind of a civilizing effect these weapons had. So, I mean, unfortunately, of course, nuclear weapons are immoral by definition. They're very dangerous, but the world is even more dangerous without them. That's my belief.
Sorry.
I mean, the more... Yes, first of all, the people of Iran, for people of Iran, I mean, not nuclear weapons, but the nuclear power is an issue of say, kind of a moral goal first. But they don't want nuclear weapons. But as to the elite, the more liberal and the more westernized it is, the more it wants nuclear weapons. And I must say that is an aberration in the analysis when people say, well, liberals Khatami. I mean, I have talked to many of the Khatami's friends and allies, etc. I mean, they, trilingual, but they do not even consider they want nuclear weapons. And we all have to remember that it was Shah, who was very pro-Western, very pro-American, who started the Iranian nuclear program.
We can certainly debate this issue for a long time, but I think I would like to give others a chance also to ask questions. Natalia, and then you.
I have 2 short questions. You spoke of an artificial battle between authoritarian capitalism and liberal capitalism, which has a vibrant civil society. In your view, what is your prediction for the trajectory that Russia will follow? in the next decade? Obviously, it has backtracked there. The second question is that Russia has been quite critical of Ukraine's recent orientation towards the West. What is your view on the prospects of Russia's relationship with its neighbor?
Good. Well, I mean, the trajectory of Russia. First of all, Russia is now, for better or for worse, I mean, is exactly having a political system which exactly corresponds to its level of development. Unfortunately, because of corruption, we are not an effective authoritarian regime. I don't like the regime, by the way, and I do not conceal that. So, I mean, and I do not conceal that, I mean, publicly in Russia or elsewhere. But it corresponds to the level of development. If things go normally, we will liberalize, but only after, again, 4 or 5, 6 years, not before. And if things go for the worse, we will go even more authoritarian. I mean, I believe that we are not yet exhausted the authoritarian option. And if there is, if there is a deepening of crises, we will go more authoritarian rather than less. Second, Russian-Ukrainian. Russian-Ukrainian relations have been excellent. I've been chairman until 2004, until Yushchenko came to power. I mean, unbelievable. I've been chairman of most Russian-Ukrainian commissions, public. Taking into consideration that it was, a country which was actually a divided nation in many ways. The relations were, sweet. We had all kind of troubles, but the relations were basically very good until 2004. Then, due to certain facts of life, Ukraine trying to join the West, then the relations deteriorate. Now I think Ukraine returns to its normal position. That's sucking 2 cows, and our relations will be very healthy again, with all kind of small difficulties, because and of course Ukraine will drift more to Russia because it has tried to drift too much to the West. It will drift more to Russia. If it is Yulia Tymoshenko, they will try to install a Putin regime with a human face. It is because Mrs. Tymoshenko, whom I adore, is a tough person. They will try to do authoritarian modernization. If not, they will go endlessly with this kind of a regime they're having, which is chaotic, basically, which is a democracy, but which does not provide for development. For the time being, it is embedded into this social structure of the country. However, you could live through that. And eventually Ukraine would become, if not teared apart artificially, and it was close to that. Eventually it will become a normal nation, no problem. And I think that Ukraine has a good future 10 years from now, but it has to live through the period of turmoil.
I can already tell that after Dr. Karaganov leaves, I think many people will still be discussing these points in the corridors of the school. Edwin, our student who's just spent a semester in St. Petersburg.
Здравствуйте, Sergey Aleksandrovitch. Спасибо большое презентация. Okay, I have a few questions to ask because I'm a student who's very interested in Russia's affair in Asia-Pacific. So I'd like to ask, what kind of vision or role do you see Russia playing in Asia-Pacific? Does it Asia-Pacific, what kind of role? Will it play a hard security role in terms of providing arms trade, defense trade? Or will it move into a soft power in terms of now that you even get Russia today in Singapore? So what kind of role and vision do you think Russia will be in Asia-Pacific for the next 5 to 10 years? And what will Russia do to achieve this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the time being, for the last 5 to 10 years or 15 years, Russia had Russia had a missed opportunity, at least during the last 7 years. It didn't use the economic growth of Asia-Pacific, but especially of Asia, to the extent it could have used. It was a lost opportunity. The reason for that was that Russia mentally is Western or our European-oriented country. And for us, I mean, modernization is only Europe. It's only now that we are starting to understand that modernization is not only Europe. And for Russia, business, a success means buying a third-rate enterprise in Britain or in Canada or in the United States, rather than investing in Malaysia or China and getting fantastic profits and fantastic growth, etc. It is changing only now, belatedly. We have lost a lot of opportunities, and I am very critical of my government and of my leadership and of my elite, which did not understand that opportunity. But now we are moving very fast towards becoming a more active player in the economic life of Asia. Unfortunately, we have very little resources rather than intellectual power, and of course resources, natural resources, and maybe food. That's where we could do better. We could integrate with some of the markets, and of course we have to diversify our Asian policies. Until again, very recently, our Asian policies were Japan, but I mean with a difficult problem. China growingly, and selling, I mean, military hardware to Asian countries, some Asian countries. Yes. That was more or less it. That was a mistake again, and I think we should diversify our relationship, both intellectual, political, and economic, in order to build up, economic and political relationship with Asian countries, as well as integrating deeper with China. We have to have a diversified, deep Asian strategy, and the part and the parcel of that strategy is what I call the Project Siberia, which has been several times discussed and then subdued. And that is that Siberia and the Far East should be developed with the help and with the capital and with the technology of all the Asian nations. And Singapore and could play a very important role as a financial intellectual hub in that process, and technological hub in that process. Because it's China, we are becoming too dependent on China. Japan has a problem, and the problem is a territorial question. It couldn't go further. And we have a dwindling human capital there. And the capital is not only decreasing in, I believe, in human capital, not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of quality. The quality human capital has been moving towards European Russia. And that's why we could not develop that area as it is without a major concerted strategy towards involving other countries from Asia and Pacific. And I hope that's one of the reasons why we are housing in 2012 the Asia Pacific Summit there. That is seen as a kind of a jumping ground, jumping board for this kind of strategy. We have to have a nation strategy. We haven't had it before. We are only building. Just 2 years ago, I was commissioned, and that is off the record, but there is nothing secret. I was commissioned to write a foreign economic strategy for Russia. And what I saw there, and I was given all kind of papers, my colleagues, and what I saw, it just appalled me, because it was absolutely late 20th century set of papers. They believed that we should, trade with that, penetrate into that market, and all the markets were Arab world and Europe, and the United States, and Portugal and Canada. And Asia was not existent anymore there, not existent in these papers almost at all, which was, I mean, a shame. Because you must understand that, I mean, Astrid knows that better than anybody else, because she was very active in the 90s in my country, helping us to overcome our revolution. I mean, we had very few resources at that time. We were surviving for about 12 years, from late Gorbachev towards the beginning of, I mean, for 14 years, where we were merely, we could not think strategically. It's only now that we are returning towards some strategic thinking.
I am in favor of ending on a positive high note that Russia is coming to Asia to have constructive and profitable relations. I would like to thank Dr. Sergey Karaganov and thank you all for coming today, for asking very good questions. It's been a very good discussion. Thank you.